Well, we have been honored to work with this group of 17 teens from the Education Coalition for Asian American Representation. The Perpetual Foreigner Series has been created and organized by them. ECAAR's commitment to educating the community is one of the things that caught our attention at KCLS. We are especially appreciative for the courage demonstrated by these students, given recent violence against Asian American women and others. I will now turn it over to members of ECAAR who will introduce part 3 of the Perpetual Foreigner Series.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to tonight's presentation. We're so happy you were all able to make it. First, we'd like to say that we're very conscious of events that took place last night in Atlanta, and we will be having a more in-depth discussion about that more towards our second group because it does relate more towards their topic of current events. So for our first topic, we're going to be talking about hate towards Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders throughout history. And throughout this presentation, you're going to be able to test your knowledge a little bit about what you've learned. And we'll be covering topics from the Chinese Exclusion Act all the way up to COVID-19. So the groups we're going to specifically be mentioning are Chinese, Japanese, Hindus, East Indians, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, and Muslims. And before we get started, we also like to acknowledge that Seattle and its surrounding areas are stolen Duwamish land. So without further ado, let's get into this.
Yeah, so the Chinese Exclusion Act, this act was signed on May 6, 1882, and by the name, you probably know or can acknowledge that this act was the first immigration law to exclude a whole ethnic group. The original act was also passed in 1882, and it only excluded certain laborers, but allowed teachers, merchants, officials, and travelers. So several Americans on the West Coast blamed Chinese workers for declining wages and economic trouble, even though they only made up to 0.02% of the nation's population. Higher wages for Chinese laborers in the gold rush of 1848 also started a wave of Chinese laborers entering the United States. And in addition, Congress also passed the act to satisfy the demands of workers and maintain this white racial purity. So in 1902, all Chinese immigration was illegal and the Chinese population quickly depleted. The 1924 revision also excluded Japanese, Middle Easterners, Hindus, and East Indians because they were seen as undesirable groups. The Chinese Exclusion Act was revised twice more until it was repealed in 1943. And this is important because this question or this answer will be on the quiz in the future of the presentation. And this Exclusion Act led to an uptick in xenophobia. So like mining laborers used xenophobic protectionists, which were like the government restrictions on foreign affairs in order to like lessen competition. And these tactics were used to set limits on the perceived erosion from Chinese workers. And the second point is that demagogue, Dennis Kearney, he led the Working Men's Party of California, who advocated to have Chinese workers excluded from California. And also in Justice John Marshall Harlan's Plessis versus Ferguson case, he claimed that the Chinese race is a race so different from our own that we do not permit those belonging it to become the citizens of the United States, which it kind of relates back to the Chinese Exclusion Act. And in 1854, the Supreme Court case that was People versus Hall ruled that Chinese people were not able to testify in court, just like the past African Americans and Native Americans, which made it kind of hard and extremely difficult to actually seek justice against their hate crimes. So here we have included 3 images that sort of explain the Chinese Exclusion Act. There seems to be have illustrations of propaganda, and I just want to put it out there. So the left photo illustrates a painting that seems to segregate Chinese workers from migrating to the US. As you can see, it writes on the wall and it shows that American workers are trying to push out the ladders when Chinese workers try to get on. The second image shows a Chinese worker waiting outside of the Gate of Liberty, which we can kind of tell that it's the gate to the US. And he sits outside with his bag of industry and a box of order. Yeah, and finally, the last photo on the right is an illustration of what kind of the Chinese exclusion bill looked like. So now you have learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and here's a small quiz for you to review. The question is, which is false about the Chinese Exclusion Act? The choices are A, when the original act was passed, it only excluded certain laborers instead of the entire ethnic group. B, Chinese workers were blamed for economic troubles and declining wages. And C, the Chinese Exclusion Act was revised 4 times until it was repealed in 1943. If you would like to, you can submit your answer in the poll provided, and we can give it some time. I also hinted or emphasized the answer in the presentation just now, so it's definitely fine if you didn't get it. Is the poll okay? Yeah, amazing. Okay, so now I think we had a fair amount of answers, and yes, the answer is C. The Chinese Exclusion Act was not revised 4 times, and so instead it was revised only 2 times. So that's a small little hint and sneaky question. Yeah, that was a presentation or the speaking of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now I can pass it on to Lauren so she can talk about the school board segregation.
Yeah, so directly following the Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese people were generally more welcomed and generally looked at more favorably than Chinese people were. And despite this, there was a policy enacted in 1893 which segregated schools for Japanese students. However, this was never enforced unless white parents had any complaints. And since there were no official complaints ever reported, this never happened. So after the Chinese Exclusion Act, anti-Asian rhetoric was extremely high. And as waves of Japanese immigrants began to come in after this Exclusion Act, some of that xenophobia began to get redirected at them. So pressure for school board segregation for Japanese and Korean students mainly came from the Korean and Japanese Exclusion League, which was created on May 7th of 1905. And their first and biggest goal was to segregate schools for Japanese and Korean students. However, a lot of their efforts went into pressuring for segregation against Japanese students, since there were only 3 Korean students in the entire San Francisco school district. So their very final form of push came in April 18th of 1906, when a huge earthquake hit San Francisco. And as you can see on the right, those were the photos of the destruction done on Chinatown. Since there was such destruction in Chinatown, a lot of the Chinese students that lived there had to flee, and the San Francisco superintendent realized that he could move Japanese and Korean students into those vacancies. So on October 11th of 1906, San Francisco School Board of Education finally adopted that policy that segregated Japanese, Korean, and Chinese students into what they called Oriental schools. And just for reference, the term Oriental is a slur because so the first is that the term was extremely popular while the perpetual foreigner stereotype was being circulated. And so it's meant to kind of make Asians seem like they're exotic and not welcomed here. And then another reason is that it's pretty demeaning and objectifying to Asian Americans, because Oriental would usually be something to describe objects such as rugs or vases, not people. So this was the first ever example of Japanese students being segregated into schools, and they had a lot of trouble getting to their school in the first place. So if you look at that red dot on the map, the section surrounding that is Chinatown, and the yellow dots on the map are where the Japanese students used to go to school. So already there's a little bit of distance there. And then they're a little bit harder to see on this map. However, the black and white dots on the map are where the actual Japanese students lived. And so as you can see, very, very few actually lived around that one school that they were allowed to go to for that little part. So this really upset Japanese people both locally and internationally in Japan. So the Japanese government got involved when they claimed that it violated the Treaty of 1894. And this treaty agreed that Japanese immigrants would be given the same rights as US citizens. So finally, the President of the United States at the time, Theodore Roosevelt, said that he disapproved of these segregated schools because he didn't believe it reflected the sentiment of the country. However, the governor, the mayor, and the school board really would not budge on the issue of segregation. And so finally, on February 15th of 1907, they came to an agreement, which is now known as the Gentleman's Agreement, saying that Roosevelt would stop immigration of Japanese laborers as long as the San Francisco School Board would reopen the schools for Japanese students. So while it did help solve one problem, it did create another problem. So one time that the perpetual foreigner stereotype was extremely common was during the Vietnam War, especially because it was extremely portrayed throughout the media. Asians were called things such as Orientals and foreigners, despite the fact that 80% of Japanese people and 50% of Chinese and Filipinos were born inside the United States. So one way this was combated was through a media source called Gidra. And what they did is that they covered Pan-Asian political identification. They commonly reported on news that was unreported by the mainstream media. And they, most importantly, gave a point of view from the war from the Asian American perspective. And so two ways that they did this was through testimonies and first-person events. So one of the very first articles on anti-Asian sentiment during the war was by Norman Nakamura in June or July of 1970. And just for reference, the Vietnam War did end in 1975, so this was relatively late into the war. And so what he did is he reported on the widespread hate towards Vietnamese people simply because US soldiers were taught that Vietnamese people should not be considered people. And so that's why it was so condoned at the time. Another person named Mike Nakayama, he lived in Detroit in 1971. He was a US soldier and he was forced to stand in front of his other soldiers during their training, and he was called racial epithets to his face, and he was made the other people to show what the enemy was supposed to look like. And since he was fighting for the US, he ended up being injured, and while he was in the hospital, he was denied medical attention until the medical staff realized that he did speak English and that he was an American citizen. So really, Gidra's main point was to promote racial equality and social change. So here on the right, you can see some of the covers that they made and how that kind of helped promote the Asian American point of view. And then on the right, on the left is some propaganda that was also used during the Vietnam War. So now we're going to take a little poll. This one's a little more for fun. It wasn't specifically covered in the presentation. However, I think it's a little fun. So the question is, what common term was rarely used before the Vietnam War? So your options are AAPI, Americans of Chinese, Japanese, or Filipino ethnicity, or Asian American. Okay, so a majority of you actually got it. So the correct answer is Asian American or Asian Pacific American. This was never used before the revolutions and the wars of the 60s. Asian American people back then were simply called Americans of Chinese, Japanese, or Filipino ethnicity, simply because those were the three biggest ethnic groups that made up the majority of Asians in the US at that time. So I'd like to give a content warning for the next three topics. The next three topics we're going to be talking about is Vincent Chin, the USA Patriot Act, and COVID-19, all of which involve racially motivated violence and death, and COVID-19 involves some verbal harassment as well. So Vincent Chin's story takes place in Detroit in the 1980s, and for some background around that time, there was a big automotive decline in Detroit, despite the fact that Detroit had once been a capital for this. And many US auto workers often blamed Japanese car manufacturers for this decline. One of Vincent Chin's attackers, named Michael Nitz, had recently lost his job at Chrysler and mistook Vincent as Japanese. And Nitz attacked Chin with his stepfather, Ronald Evans. So getting on to the actual story, on June 19th of 1982 in Detroit, Michigan, Vincent Chin and some of his friends were at a strip club celebrating his upcoming wedding. A verbal exchange quickly took place between Chin and Evans, and it started over a dancer. However, it escalated when Evans shouted at Chin, "It's because of you MFers that we're out of work." So once the fight moved outside, Evans grabbed a baseball bat from his car and he started chasing Chin with it. So Vincent Chin ran away. And around 20 minutes later, he was found by both of them, and Evans beat him to death with the bat while Nitz held him down. So Vincent Chin actually died 4 days later due to his injuries. So this event actually did not make national news. However, it severely shocked and frightened the Asian community. And their court hearing for Evans and Nitz took place on March 16th of 1983. Both were found guilty of manslaughter. However, they only received a $3,000 fine and 3 years on probation. Neither received any jail time because the judge ruling on the case decided that these aren't the kind of men you send to jail. And he thought this just because one of the attackers held a responsible job for almost 20 years and the other was a student. So this really upset several activists. And because of this, it was actually a huge turning point for Pan-Asian activism. So around 2 weeks after the sentencing, Helen Zia, who was an activist, her and some other activists created the American Citizens for Justice. And over the next few months, they worked with other groups to protest and petition for the Department of Justice to investigate his murder as a civil rights violation. So the DOJ investigated this, and in 1984, Evans was sentenced to 25 years in prison, except a retrial in 1978 cleared him of all of his charges. So they then decided to file a civil suit, which in 1978, which did require Nitz to pay $50,000 to the Chin estate over the next 10 months, and it required Evans to pay $1.5 million to the Chin estate. However, he ended up paying around $8 million from acquired interest. So moving on to more current day racism, the USA Patriot Act, the Patriot Act is also a really great example of how the perpetual foreigner stereotype is super present current day. So this was signed on October 26th of 2001 by George W. Bush, and it was in response to the events on 9/11. And so USA Patriot Act is actually an acronym for United in Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. So in Bush's words, he said that the law was to enhance the penalties that will fall on terrorists or anyone who helps them. So this act never specifically mentions a specific group or group of people to watch. However, Department of Homeland Security created a watch list, and almost every single nation on that watch list had a big Muslim population. So for example, Bangladesh was one of the countries placed on this watch list, and they have over 90% population of Muslims. And so not only this, but 4 days after 9/11, a Sikh man in Arizona was murdered simply because he was wearing a beard and a turban, and his attacker believed he looked like a terrorist, and so which was why he was killed. And this sentiment has really carried on for decades after 9/11 actually took place. For example, on January 27th of 2017, Donald Trump signed Executive Order 13769. And this was really commonly known as the Muslim ban because it banned the entry of refugees for 120 days. And it also banned visitors from 6 Muslim majority countries, which included Syria, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen.
Yeah, so COVID-19, we all know what it is. So a little overview is that starting in early January, COVID-19 related Asian discrimination started in the US, and many incidents occurred and more were reported to be physical attacks. So statistics show that over 2,100 hate incidents directed at Asian Americans were reported to the Asian Pacific Policy Planning Council and Chinese for Affirmative Action website between somewhere around March and June 2020, and this was like 3 months. And around 40% of incidents included anti-Asian slurs, so names were called and racist terms were being used as well. Around 40% of incidents took place in California, and I predict because that they have a larger population of Asian Americans residing in the area. And about around 11% of incidents were directed at elders, such as the incident when an old Asian man was pushed on the sidewalks with strong force and was eventually announced dead. Yeah. And finally, 583 people reported their gender, and those who identified as women were almost twice likely to report an incident. So as you can tell from this, women were twice likely to be targeted. Anyways, okay, let's talk about the racism that also happened in European countries as well as Asian countries. So in Italy, there was this like civil social group called, I believe, Lunaria, that has been accused of over 50 reports of assault and harassment since February. And also in the United Kingdom, Asians have been physically assaulted and taunted with people calling them terms such as immigrants and to tell them to go back to China. In Spain, there was a Chinese American man that was put into coma because he was eventually attacked by two other men, and they, of course, physically assaulted him. So I just want to say that discrimination is present against Chinese and also in like Asian countries such as Japan, South Korea, and Indonesia as well. So by late April, reporting center called Stop the AAPI Hate. If you don't know, AAPI means Asian American Pacific Islanders. And they had received around 1,500 reports of verbal and physical harassments. And in this, I believe that 125 of these reports were physical attacks. And a little update for Stop the AAPI Hate Reporting Center. So 1 day ago, they have announced to have received a total of 3,795 reports of anti-Asian hate incidents. And this was found from one of their posts on Instagram. And their @ is at Stop AAPI Hate on Instagram, and it contains a lot of information about AAPI hate. Yeah. So on the screen, there are 3 tweets from Donald Trump, and this is because political figures often blame China with names for the virus. So as you can see, former President Donald Trump referred to the virus as Chinese virus and claimed that this was China's fault. That he also claimed that this was the China virus and basically China, virus. And also, in addition, former Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, used Wuhan virus to describe the virus. It was in a video, so I couldn't add a tweet as a photo. And last point is that as National Geographic states in their history and culture page, that when leaders called COVID-19 the China virus, it harkens back to decades of state-sanctioned discrimination against Asian Americans. So when leaders uses these terms, and people would follow, and they would think that it's eventually okay, which is not. So you may wonder, or you may ask, what is a hate crime? Like, we all probably know what hate and crime means, but when should we report a hate crime, and what counts as a hate crime? Or like, what does a hate crime basically mean? So the FBI defines the hate crime as when a person willfully causes bodily injury or attempt to do so during using a dangerous weapon because of the victim's actual or perceived race, color, religion, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability of any person. Yeah, and that is basically the definition of hate crime. So victims can be all ages. For example, there was this 16-year-old high schooler that was assaulted, I believe, in around the area of Los Angeles, California, and it was on February 13th. So she was assaulted by her classmates due to the fears surrounding COVID-19. So I believe there was some sort of miscommunication or misunderstanding, but it was February 13th, 2020, so it was like the start of COVID. So in Washington State, the first reported Washington incident to the ADL was on March 11th. And if you don't know, ADL is known as the Anti-Defamation League, and their goal is to secure justice and fair treatment to all. So this University of Washington student was verbally assaulted by other passengers, and the same exact student has also been harassed earlier weeks while on the light rail. And now we can discuss the rise of Asian Americans' hate crimes recently. So firstly, I want to mention that different statistics are shown on different website sources, social media pages. So it would be more effective to go for a source that is reliable. Yeah, so here is a data table that kind of estimates the reported Asian American hate incidents, and this was by VOA News. And they stated that the increase in anti-Asian hate crime was the highest in New York City, which is the country's largest city with a sizable Asian population. Police investigated a record of 28 incidents involving Asian American victims, a more than 9-fold increase over 2019. So in summary, they had more cases or more reports from New York. And yeah, this bar graph, it shows the most common form of discrimination towards the Asian American community. So as you can tell, verbal harassment comes in first, with racial slurs, terms, and names directed towards the Asian Americans. And second that comes in is shunning. If you don't know already, shunning is a way to sort of like ignore or disregard someone through antipathy or caution. And yeah, we can pause a little bit for you to like scan over. And there are other sorts of discrimination that are towards or directed towards the Asian American community. And lastly, I want to share this graph. This graph is by the VPD, and VPD is known as the Vancouver Police Department. And they totaled anti-Asian hate crime reports through the recent years of 2019 to 2020. So this graph clearly illustrates a sudden spark in anti-Asian hate crime reports during like the May of 2020. And for your information, if you don't know, this was when COVID started to really spike and more Asians were being discriminated and targeted due to the misunderstandings of the origins of the virus. So of course, miscommunication and misunderstanding. And here are just some photos that we would like to share. The top left image shows an Asian American high schooler being harassed by her classmates as well. This was not the exact 16-year-old high schooler that I mentioned earlier, but it is similar. And the left bottom image shows an old man aggressively pushed by another person and was eventually announced dead, like the story that I mentioned earlier. And because the push was a little bit too hard, of course. And the right photo shows the face of the elderly man that was pushed, as explained in the second image. And apologies if I pronounced the name wrong, but this man's name was Vicha Ratana Pakti. I'm so sorry. Yeah, so throughout every event we have talked about in this presentation, it is important to notice that Asians are constantly scapegoated and treated as outsiders through history. And these biases have never changed, and through American history, Asians and Asian Americans have never been properly welcomed because of constant fear caused by untrue stereotypes. Until this day, Asians are still discriminated against, no matter if it's verbal harassment or physical attacks. And these attacks should not have been done, or we should all recognize the incidents that are happening currently around the world. And I believe that one of the causes that leads to these Asian discrimination comes from the misunderstandings and the lack of education in Asian history. So in our curriculums, we are mainly taught more about the European side of history instead of the prolonged history of China's dynasties or the stories of the Vietnam War that we have probably like covered a lot about in this second seminar, and more other Asian stories. So ECAAR strives to include these educational resources into our curriculum, although it might take a few steps in order to like reach our main goal or reach our goal, but we are still persistent in advocating for inclusive education of all aspects. So here are our resources and our sources and bibliography. We can leave it here for a few seconds, so maybe you can reference to it. And next, we want to thank you sponsors and partnerships with Shirti Issaquah. Their logo is the one on the right, and we want to give a huge thank you to King County Library for helping us with this successful presentation. Their logo is on the left. So we are about to finalize our presentation, and we also wanted to tell you audiences about our social media pages and our whole website made by our clubs. So if you enjoyed our presentations, you can follow us on Instagram at ECAARMI, and you can also find us at theasianamericanstory.weebly.com. Thank you so much for your time.
We'd like to open it up for questions now, I believe. Is that right, group?
Yes, that is correct. If you guys want to put any questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, then we can try and get to those.
I see one. Can you define the perpetual foreigner stereotype?
Yes, so the perpetual foreigner stereotype is basically Asian Americans are kind of grouped into this stereotype of being model minority myth and constantly treated as outsiders, like Asian Americans aren't being treated as actual American citizens. And I don't know if Garrett might want to elaborate that a little bit about that, but that's kind of like the general idea, is that they're being treated as outsiders instead of actual citizens like they are.
Yeah, and we kind of see this trend throughout history where, like, as soon as something kind of goes wrong, like obviously the baseline for Asian Americans is maybe some like microaggressions, verbal harassment. That's kind of normal. Well, it shouldn't be normal, obviously, but it's not like we're getting attacked. But then we see, like with COVID and with other things throughout history, that when something goes wrong, when something changes, Asian Americans are like the first group to be blamed, to be scapegoated. So that was kind of the idea behind Perpetual Foreigner and why we called it that, and basically the term in general.
Yeah, and then there's a question in the chat that's asking if there's gonna be some discussion on the latest shooting of the massage parlor workers. There will be, definitely. That's gonna be more covered by the second group, since their topic is about current events. So there's gonna be a much more in-depth discussion with them after the Q&A. Another question in the Q&A box came across that says, how successful have you been at mobilizing Asian American students at your school for learning and action? And have you experienced support or allyship by your non-Asian peers? If so, in what way? Yeah, this is a really great question. I think through a lot of cultural clubs that we have at MIHS, such as ECAAR, there's another one called Asian Collective. We've been really able to mobilize Asian American students, and we've been able to take action, do our best by taking action. I know Garrett has been working and talking with the principal about trying to get more recognition about the current events that have been taking place against Asian Americans. There have been, and throughout also our club, we have been trying a lot to change the curriculum of our school, since Angeline mentioned earlier that it is very Eurocentric right now. And we definitely have been supported a lot by our non-Asian peers who also join our clubs and who also help to carry on this and help with that.
Yeah, and I also want to add that, like, in our school, we have clubs that kind of gather different ethnicities or races of different people, and they kind of just support each other and teach each other about their culture. So I only know about the Asian Collective Club. They teach each other. I went to this meeting and they taught each other about sushi and the Japanese culture, and we kind of just hung out around and just recognize our own cultures together. So I think that's also like a good way that our school is doing this.
Yeah, someone's also asking what happened at the end of the Vincent Chin case, the civil suit. In the criminal case, was NITS ever sentenced beyond the original $3,000 in the fine and the 3-year probation? No, their final sentencing was with the civil rights case, and that was when NITS was ordered to pay $50,000 to the Chin estate, and Evans was ordered to pay, I believe it was 1.8 million. However, he ended up paying over $8 million. So beyond the fines, there was no prison time. And one other question came in asking if we have any advice for someone trying to start a group for AAPI students in their school. I think just getting the word out, I think people really want to join since these are such big and prevalent issues. I think just getting the word out, I think people will automatically be drawn to join the group. And I think it really helps itself by doing that.
Yeah, and I think also like promoting a lot, you might want to find it like a specific goal. Like for ECAAR, our goal is to add Asian histories in our curriculum, and that's our main goal, I guess, but that leaves more to like Garrett to speak about it. But yeah, really like promote it and show that, like reveal why it is really important to start a club like this to the outside people. So they might want to join.
Yeah, I can actually speak to this because Olivia and I did start this club this year. And I think advice would be like, first of all, everything's going to be a lot more frustrating than you expect it to be, which is kind of a theme from every social justice movement that people don't really realize. And then also just like hang in there. And yeah, I think it's easier without the hurdle of like this virtual thing, but also just take advantage of your situation. Obviously, it's easier to gather all of the people who have attended the seminar because we're virtual and you guys don't have to drive to some place. So I think to a certain extent, taking advantage of your situation is just like something that you will really learn to do with starting your own club. And yeah, just be very perseverant, I would say.
Okay, so someone else asked why Evans ended up paying more than the order since it usually goes the other way. So since he was originally fined less than $8 million, he was, with the original order, he was supposed to pay it off over 10 years towards the Chin estate. However, since he took longer to do that, he acquired interest. And since he waited so long, then he ended up having to pay more. So I hope that kind of answers it. And Garrett, maybe you want to answer this, but so I asked what kind of changes are being proposed to the curriculum? Would it be American history or world history?
Yeah, so we kind of have a two-pronged approach going on. Well, actually, it's kind of three parts. So when we talk about curriculum change, we have two main classes at Mercer Island High School that we have to focus on. It's modern world history and American studies. So basically, like for AP US history, we're trying to get more Asian American curriculum in there, basically focusing on the more Asian American side of things. And actually, our teacher who teaches that class, or at least the non-AP block, is Miss Maddox, and Miss Maddox is actually one of our advisors. So she has been actively working to try and make that better. So the Asian American thing, we kind of have a person on the inside, which is nice. But specifically, I would say probably things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Asian Exclusion Acts, things like the Continental Railroad. But yeah, it's definitely more of a challenge when it comes to AP because AP, you have a test at the end of the year that you have to worry about because they have to get a certain amount of curriculum in. So we've been actively working with teachers to try and get the Asian American history into the curriculum. In terms of world history, this is the other part of it. We're starting kind of small-ish, although it has been quite a struggle to do this, where ECAAR's been working very hard to try and get the Pacific Theater into modern world history, because I don't know about your guys's world history classes, but when we talk about modern world history, it's very much focused on Europe. And even when we talk about World War II, which is like there's two fronts, there's like the one in Europe and then there's the Pacific Theater. The Pacific Theater is almost completely ignored except for Pearl Harbor and Japanese internment. So we've been really focusing on that too, especially focusing on things like the Japanese Imperial Army and the war crimes there is something that is very important to us to get in because a lot of those survivors are dying out and we want people to be educated on it now.
One other question came into the chat asking if having more AAPI teachers would help with the situation. And I definitely think it would. I think it would really be comforting to like students to be able to see people like them reflected in authority like figures and people that they look up to. And so I think just simply by having more diversity in staff members and teachers, I think that could really help with like Asian American students. And when we're trying to get like messages out, I think they would be really quick to listen. Okay, I think I answered all of the questions that have come through so far. So if anyone has any more, then they can add those. But if not, I think we can get on to the next presentation, next topic.
Yeah, so actually, before we officially start this presentation, because it is a discussion on current events, we do want to prefix this and talk a little bit about the massage parlor accidents, or not accidents, but like massacres that happened last night. And these are very important incidents that we just want to discuss right now. And we will definitely like have more Q&A after the current event presentation to give more context to the situation. So I'll just present on it really quickly. The first thing you need to understand is that a lot of people say, I'm sure everybody knows, but like 8 women were killed by a shooter and 6 of them were Asian American. They claim that it wasn't racially motivated, but there are reports from Korean newspapers saying that he went into these massage parlors and said, "Kill all Asians," before shooting. So there is evidence that it is racially motivated, and the credibility of the shooter being taken over like firsthand accounts from store owners is a little bit appalling in my opinion, because if like news outlets would listen to people who are actually there is more evidence to be had, and like the opinion of the person who just killed people shouldn't really be included in these narratives in my opinion. But anyway, either way, he claims that it's sex motivated and that he was trying to get rid of temptation by killing people, which doesn't really make sense, because why would you do that? And also, there's definitely a problem when you think of sex workers, you think of Asian Americans, and there's an issue here where when this person thought about sex addiction, they fetishized Asian American women. So it's gender based, so it's misogynistic, and B, it's racially motivated. So we just wanted to get that out of the way. Also, I want to make sure that people understand that it's very difficult to lead conversations about this for Asian Americans. And like we're here doing this, but for people who aren't specifically leading a presentation for this purpose, don't expect them to have all the answers, to be okay. Make sure to check in on them, make sure they're doing okay today. Because I know a lot of the Asian American community is reeling, and there's been very little support from companies and systems. Like I know that our school, only the superintendent said something just now, but like the principal and all of the teachers were completely silent throughout the entire day. So this just goes to show that there's a lot of work to be done. And I just want to pretext the following presentation with this. And without further ado, I'll hand it off to Sarah, who will start the presentation.
Okay, hi everybody. Today we'll be discussing racism and current events, and the groups that will be specifically mentioned are Asian American groups, including Chinese and Chinese Americans, Vietnamese and Vietnamese Americans. Before we would like to acknowledge that everybody living in the Seattle area is currently living on stolen Duwamish land. Next slide, Sophia. Thank you. 2 things before we start. There's a slight trigger warning there's mentions of violence against Asian Americans. And on your screen, you'll see a video that will provide an overview for the topics we'll be discussing today. And second thing, due to unfortunate miscommunication, I'm going to be repeating a lot of the information that was already covered by the other group. Yet a lot of it is valuable enough where it bears repeating. So hopefully I can provide more info about COVID-19's impact on Asian Americans, and you'll receive new information about social media and movies from Sophia. So here we go.
It's been heartbreaking and devastating for me and so many Asian Americans.
Andrew Yang, New York City Democratic mayoral hopeful, tells CNN that while former President Donald Trump's rhetoric may have fanned the flames of anti-Asian sentiment, Kung flu, racism against Asians is nothing new.
Certainly having the President of the United States saying things like Kung flu and China virus did normalize an association between the pandemic and people of Asian descent.
Our employees are heavily impacted by this.
Jason Wang, CEO of Xi'an Famous Foods, says violence against two of his Asian employees on public transit in separate incidents gave him no choice but to cut his business hours at all 8 Chinese restaurants.
One was punched so hard that his glasses broke.
Despite the pandemic forcing him to already close 6 locations, Wang says safety is more important than the bottom line.
One of the biggest reasons for that is to make sure that our employees feel at least a little bit safer about traveling back home.
Even with many Asian American celebrities like former NBA star Jeremy Lin and actress Olivia Munn speaking out about the hate, and lawmakers raising concerns about this disturbing trend.
These are totally unprovoked attacks.
Some feel crimes against Asians need to be taken more seriously.
Government is still figuring out how to properly serve Asian Americans. And so, even prosecutors have to understand the nature of discrimination against Asian Americans.
I think that the Asians should speak up and work on solidarity so that the authorities would listen.
And Don, Noel Quintana is still recovering from that face lashing, and he tells me he's just too afraid to ride the subway again or take any public transportation for that matter. And as a result, he's now working from home. I've got to tell you, I've spoken with a lot of Asian Americans in recent days, and they tell me they don't remember a time where they've actually had to think twice about their safety before going about their daily routines. Don?
Lactate is 100% real milk, just without the lactose, so you can enjoy it even if...
Thank you, Sophia. Okay. The usage of the phrase China virus erases blame from other nations, primarily the US, whose response to the pandemic was, in short, abysmal. With the United States leading globally in COVID cases and deaths, it is evident that the response to the pandemic was far from ideal. The explicit discriminatory behavior perpetuated by those who presume these stereotypes to be true is representative of the scapegoating against the Asian Americans that has become all too common. It has become increasingly normalized to claim that calling COVID-19 the China virus or other such names is now deemed acceptable due to other variants gaining prevalence, yet this is far from true. Both SARS-CoV-2 or the coronavirus disease 2019 are far more technical terms, and the taxonomy of the virus itself has continued to update over the course of the response to the pandemic. Put simply, it is abbreviated to COVID-19 because of the structure of the virus. The China virus is no longer a phrase that is indicative of location of origin. Rather, it has become emblematic of the intolerance and hatred that has become increasingly common during this time. The World Health Organization recommends against naming viruses after specific regions because it can lead people to be unfairly stigmatized, especially in ethnic groups. In the United States, Asian Americans are concerned that such racialized language will make them the target of bigotry. Derogatory terms like these legitimize the discriminatory actions of some of the American population, especially when the China virus was a commonly used term within the White House. On March 19th, 2020, Jevin Botsford, a Washington Post photographer, captured former President Trump crossing out Corona and replacing it with China. Shortly after the briefing, Trump defended his actions by claiming that it wasn't racist at all and it comes from China, that's why. This incident was only the beginning of anti-Asian hate due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And although the other group previously mentioned, Vincent Chin, if you missed it, I'll be giving a brief recap. The xenophobia against Asian Americans has been pertinent for centuries, but with the prevalence of COVID-19, hate crimes against Asian American individuals in the pandemic have continued to rise. These recent incidents remind us of Vincent Chin. In 1982, Vincent Chin, an Asian American man in Detroit, Michigan, died after being attacked because of his race. At this time, the growing Japanese auto industry was leading a major job loss in Detroit's own auto sector. And two co-workers and future murderers mistook him for a Japanese person. When celebrating his bachelor party, both co-workers used racial slurs while beating him. It was this incident that caused his death days later. This motivated individuals from diverse backgrounds to unite against Asian American racism through peaceful protesting, but many of those who advocated for Vincent Chin warned of similar scapegoating towards Asian American Pacific Islander or AAPI or the AAPI community through the lens of the COVID-19 pandemic. Quote, instead of blaming Japan, we're now blaming China and anyone who looks Chinese, end quote, said Helen Xia, a Chinese American activist who helped to found a Pan-Asian civil rights group called the American Citizens for Justice following the sentencing of Chin's killers. The two men ultimately paid a $3,000 fine and served no prison time. Xia continued that, quote, it's actually pretty terrifying for most people because we have been through this before, and we know what dog whistles racism, and calling people who look a certain way the enemy, we know what that leads to, end quote. More recent physical instances of AAPI violence have occurred as well. An 84-year-old man from Thailand was walking in San Francisco and for no apparent reason was slammed into the ground. He died 2 days later in the hospital. His family believed that the attack was a hate crime and was targeted because of his race. Unfortunately, he is far from the only anti-Asian violence incident of anti-Asian violence in recent months. In late January, a 91-year-old man was shoved from behind a stranger while walking down the street in Oakland's Chinatown. He fell down face first but survived. The assault happened in daylight directly outside the Asian Resource Center, a gathering spot for the Asian American community. A 28-year-old man was charged with the attack. Both episodes were caught on tape by security cameras, but thousands of physical, verbal, or digital attacks have occurred with no police record of the incidents. When nationwide shutdowns began in March, the FBI warned against hate crimes against Asian and Asian American communities would grow, according to reports obtained by ABC News. Anti-Asian racism, which has been a persistent part of American history, now includes coronavirus-related sentiment. This is detailed by the website Stop AAPI Hate, which has been tracking anti-Asian discriminatory incidents since mid-March. It has identified almost 3,000 incidents from March to December of 2020 alone, with almost 40% of verbal, physical, or online assaults mentioning China or Chinese in a derogatory manner. This is a 1,900% increase in anti-AAPI hate crimes. The recent hate crimes not only impact the daily lives of Asian Americans, but discrimination in education, housing, and employment are also on the rise. The United States Commission on Civil Rights published their findings in early May to address and reduce anti-Asian xenophobia, writing that, quote, given the rise in anti-Asian sentiment reported in recent weeks and months, it is important that the federal government is conscious of the particular needs of the Asian American community, end quote. In summary, the implicit bias that some hold transform into acts of violence that are synonymous with the COVID-19 pandemic. Although what Sophia will be discussing next is not a physical form of intolerance, it is indicative of the persistent anti-Asian American rhetoric that has been prevalent for decades.
Okay, so next we're going to be taking a little bit of a change. We're going to be talking about social media trends and how they kind of relate to Asian culture. So first, as you can see these pictures, this is the fox eye trend. As you can see, there's a makeup style and a pose that generally accompanies it. According to the makeup stylist who created the look, it creates a sultry effect. However, the Asians who grew up mocked for their slanted eyes are a bit confused why influencers are praised for mimicking their eyes, while they were discriminated against for having them. Like many of the other beauty trends that have come and gone over the years, the fox hair trend will eventually lose popularity. According to Stephanie Hu, the designer or the founder of Dear Asian Youth, which encourages Asian activism, that's exactly the problem. In a phone interview with CNN, she said, "It really feels like this is a temporary trend and that the shape of Asian eyes is not something to be casually adopted and then given back when the trend is over." Next, we're going to look at jade bracelets. In Vietnamese, Chinese, and more cultures, jade bracelets are seen as living things that protect their wearer from spiritual harm and physical harm. It's generally seen as a good luck token, and when it turns cloudy, it signifies that negative energy was absorbed. If the bracelet actually breaks, it means that it protected the wearer from negative energy, or it even saved their life. Jade bracelets must be gifted, and once they are put on, they're not supposed to come off until they break. They're often gifted to children by their parents as a symbol of love and protection. In the past few months, jade bracelets have grown in popularity over social media. Non-Asian retailers have begun to sell jade bracelets without understanding the full significance, and people have begun to buy them and use them as accessories without realizing the full meaning behind them. In November of 2020, 3 American women decided to open a mahjong company. They decided that the traditional game of mahjong was not colorful enough and it didn't fit their personal styles. So they decided to refresh it so it would reflect their more fun styles and personalities. They wrote all of this in the earliest version of their About Us page on their website. Using terms like the word refresh deeply wounded many Asians and brought back memories of the centuries of cultural erasure that Asians have experienced. Furthermore, as Rainier Chung, the author of Asia 1, stated, mahjong is meant to be played where you can easily identify the tiles. Remaking the tiles so that they have multiple different images defeats the purpose of being able to recognize tiles across different sets. Having different sets with different colors, designs, and themes makes players have to relearn every tile before playing. Some of their sets include flowers, chickens, and men in dragon suits. The Mahjong line, the company, sells 5 sets in a variety of neon colors, costing from $325 to $425. The set on the slide you're looking at is one of the $425 ones. Here's a traditional mahjong set if you haven't seen one before. Of course, mahjong has gone through many changes since it was first introduced hundreds of years ago. Throughout these changes, however, it's always included the original traditional characters and symbols. In the mahjong line's case, they didn't do the research to understand that mahjong symbols are carved on so that players can mopai or feel the tile. With the designs painted on, the paint will most likely come off if you rub it. So you might be wondering why we're talking about these three examples without any forewarning or anything. So we're going to take a quick look at the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. There's a long-standing debate on what crosses the line. Everyone has their own opinion and might define that line differently. However, here are some points generally agreed upon. Cultural appropriation often uses inaccurate representation that ridicules the culture and its people. In many cases, proper research was not done, and that's how this happens. The vast majority of people agree that when people begin to make money off appropriation without highlighting the people of that culture is when the line is crossed. For example, people who copy parts of a culture to get their own gain while not giving credit or uplifting members of that community, that's cultural appropriation. Cultural appreciation, on the other hand, highlights the culture and the community, and thorough research is done in order to be sure that they're representing it. Well, you in particular might not think of some of the examples we have explained or are explaining are cultural appreciation, others do, but it's really important we make sure their opinions are talked about as well. And next, we're going to have some poll questions. If you choose an answer that's in the minority for a question, don't feel bad. Everyone's entitled to their own opinions. However, it's important to be, looks like those started a little soon. However, it's important to be open. Some of these answers are just yes or no, rather than in a gray area, which is how you might feel. And some are purposely difficult and easy to answer, and that's also we can see where the line is. So we've already explained the fox eye trend. You can just choose if it's appropriation or appreciation on your poll. And I'm going to move through these a little bit fast, just so I can get to the ones that might take up a little more time since we've already explained these. And the jade bracelet as well, I've explained how it's been taken on by non-Asian retailers who don't understand the significance. And then our first scenario is very hypothetical. Just imagine yourself as a person in this situation. and it's just taking a Chinese class in school. Does that count as appropriation or appreciation? Okay, and then the mahjong ladies that we have explained, do they refreshing this game? Do you think that counts as appropriation or appreciation? And then Halloween costumes, for example, geisha costumes, which we don't see as often anymore, but I know they were more popular back like 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And here's some examples. And then if a non-Asian store sells a collection of clothing marketed as the Lunar New Year collection. So for example, one of the stores, Aritzia, had a Lunar New Year collection this year. The clothing was primarily just red t-shirts. And then we have just a white family opens up a Chinese food restaurant after living in China for the past 4 years. Does that count as appropriation or appreciation? And then the chopstick hairdo, and here's an example of it. So, for example, if you are non-Asian and you use Asian utensils as decorative pieces for your hair, and then just going out to get bubble tea or other Asian foods as a non-Asian person, is that appropriation or appreciation? And then our final scenario is if you as a white person dress in traditional clothing at your Asian mother-in-law's request, would that be appropriation or appreciation? Okay, so we can give you guys a few more seconds to finish up answering those if it took you a bit, and then we can close the poll and share the results. Okay, Sarah, I don't know if you're sharing them or not. Okay, so it looks like on the first one, everyone agreed that that the fox eye trend was appropriation. And on the jade bracelet one, I can see that one was a little mixed. The majority of people thought that it was appropriation, which is pretty understandable since it is non-white retailers making money. But if they did do their research, then it would be appreciation. And the refresh, the majority of people once again thought that was appropriation. Geisha costumes, appropriation, which is, I would assume, fairly obvious. And then the Lunar New Year collection, it looks like that one was mixed as well. Half the people, or about half, thought it was appropriation, and the other half thought it was appreciation. And that one, actually, I did a little more research after we put that into our presentation, and the designers of that collection were actually Asian. So, and then opening up a Chinese restaurant, that would be appreciation, which if they did live in China, I would assume they appreciate the culture. And then the chopstick hairdo, the majority of people agreed that one was appropriation. Bubble tea, appreciation. And then wearing traditional clothing, that would also be appreciation. It looks like people agreed. And then taking a school Chinese class, people agreed that was appreciation. So I think that kind of plays into our definition that we gave earlier, where making money is really the line. And a lot of other things like taking a school Chinese class, that sort of thing is okay because you're learning about the culture and you're understanding it. So, now we're going to move on and talk about our third and final part of our presentation, which is stereotypes in movies. So first, we're going to take a little look backward. Movies like 16 Candles and Breakfast at Tiffany's are both really great examples of hit movies that represented Asians according to a certain stereotype. In 16 Candles, Long Duk Dong is the Baker family's foreign exchange student. He's portrayed as a silly, inexperienced boy who's fresh off the boat. He speaks a lot of broken English, has a bad haircut, and is shown not knowing how to use a fork and knife and trying to use them like chopsticks. He tries to speak English, saying things like, "Oh, no more Yankee my Wanky," and the donger needs food, leading to his nickname, the Donger. To make matters worse, every time he enters a scene, he's accompanied by a gong. When 16 Candles first came out, it was an immediate hit. Long Dok Thong was constantly quoted and gave high school kids new ammunition. According to Martin Wong in an interview with NPR, any Asian guy in high school or junior high during this time was immediately called Donger. In Breakfast at Tiffany's, Mr. Yanyoshi is reflective of the Japanese stereotypes that Japanese people faced post-World War I, or World War II, I mean. He is depicted as clumsy. He accidentally trips and loses glasses a lot as he rushes to answer a door. He has buck teeth, very narrow eyes, and speaks very broken English that's almost impossible to understand. In the opening scene where he's tripping over everything, it enforces a stereotype that Asians cannot see through their eyes. However, it gets worse when you take into account that Mr. Yanyoshi is played by Mickey Rooney, a white man. This means that Mickey had to use yellowface while playing this role, and this is representative of whitewashing. If you don't know what yellowface is, it's essentially coloring the face yellow to make it look more like stereotypical Asian skin. And yellowface also includes pulling your eyes back and doing anything that makes you portray more Asian. And yeah. So here is a clip to pull it up real quick. This is just a quick clip from Breakfast at Tiffany's, the opening scene that I've described. And you might have to turn the volume up.
Mr. Go right way. Someday, Mr. Go right way. What happened to you anyway? You take off for the powder room, and that's the last I see you.
Now, really, Harry?
Harry was the other guy. I'm Sid Arbuck. You like me, remember? Mr. Go right way. I protest.
Oh, darling, I am sorry, but I lost my key.
But that was 2 weeks ago. You cannot go on or keep ringing my bell. You disturb me. You must have a key made.
But it won't do any good. I just lose them all.
Come on, baby. You like me. You know you do.
I worship you, Mr.
So, as I'm sure you could tell from that clip, he was really portrayed as irritable. I know I couldn't understand what he was saying, and I don't know if you guys could, but this all just reinforces the stereotypes that were really prevalent after World War II. And they kind of, dehumanized or demonized even some Asians. But, you might be saying that was so long ago. It was like 40 to 50 years ago. Times have changed, right? Well, you would be wrong. So here's some movie stereotypes today. There's a smart Asian best friend. He usually has glasses. He's usually nerdy. They're book smart, but not really street smart. And they have really stern parents who oppress them when they want to be more like their modern friends. A really good example of this is Lane from the still popular early 2000s comedy Gilmore Girls. She has to do things like hide her CDs under the floorboard because her mom would get mad at her. She also has to hide the fact that she's in a rock band because her mother wants her to be a doctor and insists on her studying and getting good grades to do so. The mother continually sets her up with other Korean boys, many of whom are doctors, in hopes she'll marry them. This further perpetuates the stereotype that Asians are forced to become doctors by their parents, as well as the stereotype that all Asians are doctors. When Lane ends up marrying a white boy, her mother is very mad at her and refuses to talk to her. Her mother also has a girl from Korea come stay with them for a brief period of time. The girl is very meek and quiet and spends a lot of her time reading and studying. Later, there's a scene where Lane shows the other girl her collection of rock CDs, and the girl finally begins to stand up to Lane's mom and disobey her, doing things like not adhering to the curfew. This serves to promote a mentality that Asians are oppressed by their own parents and forced to do things they don't want to, further promoting an idea that Asian parents are rude, mean, and oppress their children. Furthermore, the writers of Gilmore Girls are white, meaning that the way they portray Lane and her mother are their views of Korean people. So let's talk a little bit more about whitewashing, because I know I kind of mentioned that in the last section. Merriam-Webster defines it as to alter something in a way that favors, features, or caters to white people, such as to alter an original story by casting a white performer in a role based on a non-white person or fictional character. And we're going to talk about some examples of that in entertainment today. So in the live-action Avatar: The Last Airbender, as well as the live-action Ghost in the Shell, which was a Japanese manga and an anime classic, Scarlett Johansson was cast as the main character in the futuristic world. And then in Marvel's Doctor Strange, the Ancient One is cast as a white woman, while in the comics, he's portrayed as an elderly Asian man. In the 2015 film Aloha, which starred Emma Stone and Bradley Cooper, Emma Stone is cast as a person of Chinese and Hawaiian descent. The film was mostly white characters, even though Hawaii is over 70% not white. In The Great Wall, Matt Damon plays the lead role, a mercenary who discovers secrets behind the Great Wall and must lead an army of elite warriors to fight monsters, possibly reinforcing white savior stereotypes. Let's go in depth in 2 main examples. So in the live action of Avatar, the only person of color was the villain. Since the original show was heavily influenced by Japanese anime and East Asian culture, this was very surprising. Here's Aang in the cartoon version versus Aang in the live action. So Death Note was a Japanese show, but most of the live action had a non-Japanese cast, including the main character. Instead of taking place in Japan, it took place in Seattle, Washington, in the US. Light Yagami's name was changed to Light Turner. Since Yagami is written with the characters of Night and God, and Lights is written with Moon, the name is very symbolic, and the live action just changed it to an American name, completely ignoring that. But you might be saying that some of the characters look white, and wouldn't it make more sense to cast white characters in these roles? Well, European colonialism influenced many of Asia's beauty standards. The most popular plastic surgery procedures in East Asia are nose jobs to obtain a thin nose, double eyelid surgeries, gluten injections for pale skin, jawline injections for high cheekbones, and liposections to attain skinny legs. Although certain traits like striving for wider skin can be traced back to historical origins, traits such as double eyelids and thin noses are not traditional East Asian features. In the past, wider skin meant you had enough money to not work in fields and was seen as a type of status symbol. Movies, shows, and magazines that depict tall, light-skinned, and haired, big-eyed people cause pressure for the girls and boys who look not as much like that. Jessica Yang, a junior and leader of the Asian Student Association, says that to hold people of color in these societies to the beauty standards of Europeans because they aren't European, and naturally there won't be as many people who are able to hold up to those standards. Okay, and I'll hand it over to Sarah to discuss some more information.
Okay, so basically you can screenshot this if your device has the ability to do that, to provide some further information about organizations, educational media, and just some basic information about what you can do to further support these movements. Back to you, Sophia.
Okay, also I think our PowerPoint is going to be available. We'll send a link in the chat, and I think it might be posted somewhere else as well, but I'm not sure. So if you miss any more information here, you can always check out those. And here's our bibliography. It's a few pages. So once again, when we send that in the chat, you can check out those links. So we're going to take questions a bit at the end. We want to thank our sponsors, Share Tea and KCLS, for hosting this. It was really great of them, or for helping us host this. You can check out our website, theasianamericanstory.weebly.com, for more information, and our Instagram, ECAAR MI, they post really good infographics. If you love this information, they post a lot of stuff like it, and it's a really good way to keep up to date. And I think I'm going to hand it over. Oh, we have credits for this beautiful slide template from Slides Carnival. And yeah, I'll hand it over to Garrett to talk a little bit more about possible future stuff.
Thanks, Sophia. Yeah, so thank you to everyone who came to all 3 seminars. I know there's a select few of you guys. We seriously appreciate your guys' participation in this. And like even by attending, you are dismantling the model minority myth, and we really appreciate that. And also just like having your support means a lot to us as well. In terms of next steps, keep an eye out for future programs that we will do with KCLS, including maybe next year we're planning on doing some classes, some other free stuff. And yeah, if you want to donate, there's a donation link on our website, but it helps us keep everything free. And yeah, we have a lot of good plans, so keep an eye out for us, and follow us on Instagram. And we'll try to get the word out in case there's any future events. And now I think we can open it up to Q&A for Sarah and Sophia. And also the rest of the panel if you guys want to respond as well.